Picture this. It's late June 1776. In a sweltering room in Philadelphia, a 33-year-old man sits alone at a portable wooden desk, quill pen trembling slightly in his hand. Outside, the streets are filled with tension. British warships patrol the harbors. Soldiers march. The threat of execution hangs over everyone in the Continental Congress. This young man knows that what he's writing could cost him everything: his fortune, his family, his life, but he writes anyway. The words flow onto the parchment. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. In this moment, Thomas Jefferson isn't just writing a document. He's crafting the philosophical foundation for a new kind of nation, one that has never existed before. A nation built not on the divine right of kings, but on the radical idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. This is the story of the man behind those words. But here's what makes it fascinating. Thomas Jefferson was a walking contradiction. A man who wrote that all men are created equal while enslaving hundreds of people. A champion of limited government who expanded presidential power beyond anything the founders imagined. A believer in simplicity who lived in luxury and died deeply in debt. His life tells us something profound about America itself, about our highest ideals and our deepest failures, about the complicated, messy, brilliant, and tragic reality of trying to build a more perfect union. This is the complete story of Thomas Jefferson, from his birth in the Virginia wilderness to his death on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's a story about genius and hypocrisy, vision and blindness, triumph and tragedy. And it begins on a spring day in 1743 at a plantation called Shadwell. Along the Rivanna River, near the Blue Ridge Mountains of colonial Virginia, Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation in what was then Goochland County, Virginia, later renamed Albemarle County. He entered a world of wealth and privilege, but also a world perched on the edge of civilization. Where the wilderness began just beyond the plantation gates, his father was Peter Jefferson, a self-made man of remarkable abilities. Peter was a surveyor, a planter, and a slaveholder who had carved out an estate from the Virginia frontier. He was physically powerful. Legend said he could raise 2,000-pound hogsheads of tobacco at once. More importantly, he possessed an inquiring mind and a determination to provide his children with the best education possible. Thomas's mother was Jane Randolph Jefferson, daughter of one of Virginia's most distinguished families. The Randolphs were Virginia aristocracy, connected to the colony's political and social elite. Through his mother, young Thomas could trace his lineage to English nobility and claim kinship with many of Virginia's most powerful families. This combination, his father's frontier strength and practical intelligence, his mother's aristocratic connections, would shape everything about Thomas Jefferson's life. Thomas was the third of 10 children and the first son. His earliest memory, recorded years later, was of being carried on a pillow by an enslaved person during a 50-mile journey when he was just 3 years old. Even this innocent childhood memory reveals the world he was born into, a world where enslaved people performed even the most intimate family tasks. The Shadwell Plantation, where Thomas grew up, sprawled across thousands of acres. It was supported by the labor of at least 60 enslaved people who worked the tobacco fields, maintained the house, and performed every task necessary to keep the estate running. Young Thomas grew up in this environment of paradox. He roamed the wilderness freely, exploring the forests and mountains, developing a love of nature that would last his entire life. He watched his father survey land, learning the value of precision and scientific observation. He saw the enslaved people who made his comfortable life possible, though how he processed this as a child, we can only imagine. His father, Peter, believed deeply in education. In an era when many frontier planters saw little need for book learning, Peter Jefferson insisted his children receive thorough instruction. He owned a library of 42 books, a substantial collection for the Virginia frontier, and these books opened young Thomas's mind to worlds beyond Albemarle County. But in 1757, when Thomas was just 14 years old, tragedy struck. Peter Jefferson died suddenly, leaving his family grief-stricken and his eldest son thrust into adult responsibilities far earlier than expected. At 14, Thomas inherited approximately 5,000 acres of land and dozens of enslaved people. He became the man of the family, responsible for his mother and younger siblings. This loss marked Thomas profoundly. Years later, he would write almost nothing about his father, as if the wound remained too deep to examine. But Peter's legacy lived on in Thomas's character: the dedication to learning, the appreciation for practical skills, the belief that a man should master multiple disciplines. The young heir to Shadwell was described as tall and gangly, with reddish hair and hazel eyes. He was quiet, almost shy, uncomfortable with public speaking, but brilliant in private conversation. He loved music, practiced the violin for hours each day, and showed an early aptitude for mathematics and languages. Peter. Jefferson's will had specified that Thomas receive a classical education. 2 years before his death, Peter had enrolled his son with Reverend James Morey, who ran a small but distinguished boarding school. Morey was a graduate of the College of William and Mary, and he introduced young Thomas to Latin, Greek, and French, the languages that would unlock the great works of Western civilization. Under Morey's tutelage, Thomas discovered ancient philosophy, Roman history, and Enlightenment thought. He learned that men in ancient republics had once governed themselves without kings. He read about natural rights and social contracts. He encountered ideas that challenged everything he'd been taught about how society should be organized. These years from age 14 to 17 were transformative. Thomas wasn't just studying, he was building the intellectual foundation for revolution. He didn't know it yet. The boy who lost his father at 14 was preparing to become one of the fathers of a new nation. At 17, with his mind sharpened by years of intensive study, Thomas Jefferson left the Virginia Piedmont for the colonial capital of Williamsburg. He was heading to the College of William and Mary. Ready to step onto a larger stage, he carried with him his father's legacy of determination, his mother's aristocratic connections, and a brilliant mind hungry for knowledge. But he also carried the contradictions of his society, the ideals of liberty learned from books, and the reality of slavery that supported his entire way of life. The boy from Shadwell was about to become someone who would change the world. But first, he had much to learn. In March 1760, 16-year-old Thomas Jefferson arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia's colonial capital, and his world expanded exponentially. Williamsburg was nothing like the rustic plantation life of Shadwell. Here was a real city, small by European standards, but the center of Virginia's political, social, and intellectual life. The royal governor lived here. The House of Burgesses met here. Taverns buzzed with political debate. Theater companies performed, and the College of William and Mary stood as the intellectual jewel of the South, second only to Harvard in the colonies. Jefferson would spend the next 7 years in Williamsburg, and these years would shape everything that followed. At William and Mary, Jefferson threw himself into his studies with ferocious intensity. He later claimed he studied 15 hours a day, and those who knew him believed it. He would rise early, study until the afternoon, run a mile outside the city to exercise, then return to study late into the night. He studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and the natural sciences. But more than the subjects themselves, what transformed Jefferson was the men who taught him and the ideas they introduced. The most influential was Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor who taught mathematics and philosophy. Small was unusual for his time, a man of the Enlightenment who believed in reason, scientific inquiry, and the perfectibility of human society. He introduced Jefferson to the works of Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke, the Trinity of thinkers. Jefferson would later call the 3 greatest men who ever lived. Small saw something special in young Jefferson. He took the shy, brilliant student under his wing, inviting him to private dinners and discussions. Through Small, Jefferson learned that knowledge wasn't just about memorizing facts, it was about questioning, analyzing, and discovering truth through observation and reason. Small also introduced Jefferson to 2 men who would become crucial mentors, Governor Francis Fauquier and George Wythe. Governor Fauquier was an intellectual aristocrat. A man who loved music, philosophy, and good conversation, he regularly invited Jefferson to dinner at the governor's palace, where the young student found himself dining with Virginia's elite, discussing everything from classical literature to colonial politics. These dinners were Jefferson's introduction to the world of statecraft and diplomacy. But the most important relationship Jefferson formed was with George Wythe. Wythe was Virginia's most respected legal mind, a brilliant lawyer, a classical scholar, and a man of unimpeachable integrity. More importantly, Wythe was a teacher who believed in developing not just legal skills but moral character. In 1762, after completing his formal education at William and Mary, Jefferson began studying law under Wythe. This wasn't casual. Study it was an intensive 5-year apprenticeship that Jefferson later described as the most rigorous intellectual training imaginable. Every day, Jefferson would read law books for hours, taking detailed notes in his own shorthand system. Wythe didn't just teach him legal precedents, he taught him to think like a lawyer, to analyze arguments, spot logical fallacies, and construct airtight reasoning. They read Greek and Roman law together. They discussed political philosophy and the rights of man. They examined the foundations of English common law and questioned whether those foundations truly serve justice. Wythe also taught by example. He lived modestly despite his success. He treated people of all backgrounds with respect even. Remarkably for his time and place, teaching reading to enslaved people. He believed that law should serve moral purpose, not just the powerful. Jefferson absorbed all of this. In his legal commonplace book, a massive collection of notes he kept throughout his studies, we can see his mind at work. He wasn't just memorizing cases. He was thinking deeply about fundamental questions. What gives government legitimacy? When do people have the right to resist tyranny? What are the natural rights that no government can rightfully violate? These weren't academic questions. In 1765, while Jefferson was still studying law, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, imposing direct taxation on the colonies without their consent. Jefferson was in the Virginia House of Burgesses Gallery when Patrick Henry delivered his famous speech declaring that taxation without representation was tyranny. The chamber erupted. Some shouted treason. Others cheered. Jefferson, standing in the doorway, watched as the older generation of Virginia leaders tried to maintain loyalty to Britain while Henry's fiery words lit a spark of resistance. Jefferson never forgot that moment. He later wrote that it was Patrick Henry's eloquence that first moved him to think seriously about American rights and British tyranny. But while Henry swayed crowds with passion, Jefferson was developing a different kind of power, the power of careful reasoning expressed through clear, beautiful prose. During these Williamsburg years, Jefferson became more than just a lawyer and scholar. He became a Renaissance man, pursuing every subject that interested his restless mind. He studied architecture, teaching himself from books since there were no formal teachers available. He was appalled by what he considered the ugly buildings of colonial Virginia, and he dreamed of creating something more beautiful, more elegant, more worthy of a civilized society. He continued his violin practice, reaching a high level of proficiency. He joined a weekly musical society and spent many evenings playing chamber music with friends. Music, he believed, elevated the soul and softened the rough edges of frontier life. He studied agriculture and botany, filling notebooks with observations about plants, weather, and farming techniques. He believed that scientific agriculture could improve society by increasing prosperity and reducing the backbreaking labor of farming. He copied out passages from hundreds of books, building what he called his literary commonplace book, a collection of wisdom from ancient philosophers, modern poets, and contemporary thinkers. These weren't random quotes. Jefferson carefully selected passages that spoke to questions he was wrestling with about how to live a good life and build a just society. And he observed. Jefferson had a scientific mind that noticed everything: the temperature, the date when particular flowers bloomed, the migration patterns of birds, the best techniques for grafting fruit trees. He believed that close observation of nature revealed patterns and truths that could guide human action. In 1767, at age 24, Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar. He had completed his transformation from a frontier planter's son to one of the most learned men in Virginia. But what kind of man had he become? Physically, he was striking over 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when most men were much shorter. He had reddish hair that he wore unpowdered, unlike the fashion of the day. His face was thin, with sharp features and pale blue eyes. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously, preferring quiet elegance to showy display. In personality, he remained shy and soft-spoken. He never became a powerful public speaker. His voice was too quiet, and he disliked the rough and tumble of public debate. But in small groups, in private conversation, he was magnetic. He had a way of making people feel heard, of asking questions that got to the heart of matters, of explaining complex ideas with luminous clarity. Intellectually, he was a strange combination. On one hand, he believed passionately in reason, science, and progress. He thought the Enlightenment had shown the way forward, that careful observation, logical thinking, and commitment to human rights could create a better world. On the other hand, he was deeply traditional in many ways. He never questioned his right to hold enslaved people as property, even as he read philosophers who argued passionately against slavery. He believed in the fundamental importance of agriculture and mistrusted cities and manufacturing. Even as the world was moving toward industrialization, he lived in a mansion supported by enslaved labor. While preaching the virtues of simple Republican living, these contradictions would haunt Jefferson his entire life. But in 1767, as he launched his legal career, they seemed less pressing. He was young, brilliant, and ambitious. The world seemed full of possibility. He opened a law office and quickly built a thriving practice, handling cases throughout Virginia. He represented planters in land disputes, drew up wills and contracts, and occasionally defended enslaved people in freedom suits, though he almost always lost these cases. Given the laws of Virginia, he also began thinking about politics. In 1769, at age 26, he would be elected to the House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. The shy scholar was about to enter the arena of power. But before politics consumed him, there was one more crucial event. In these formative years, he fell in love. In 1768, Thomas Jefferson began construction on a home. But it wasn't just a house, it was a dream made manifest. A statement about who he was and who he wanted to become. He called it Monticello, Italian for little mountain. Jefferson had chosen a site at the top of a mountain on his inherited land, a spot with spectacular views of the Virginia Piedmont stretching to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Friends thought he was crazy to build on a mountaintop where every brick, every timber, every bucket of water would have to be hauled uphill. But Jefferson had his vision, and he pursued it with characteristic intensity. He designed the house himself, teaching himself architecture from books, studying the work of Andrea Palladio, a 16th-century Italian architect whose classical proportions Jefferson found beautiful and harmonious. Monticello would be his lifelong project, constantly torn down and rebuilt as Jefferson's ideas evolved. But in 1768, he was focused on getting at least part of the house livable because he had met someone. Her name was Martha Wayles Skelton. She was 22 years old, a wealthy young widow with a 4-year-old son from her first marriage. She was cultured, intelligent, and accomplished. She played the harpsichord and sang beautifully. And Thomas Jefferson, the shy scholar, fell completely in love with her. The courtship was proper by the standards of the time, but there was genuine romance there. They played music together, Martha on harpsichord, Thomas on violin. They read to each other. They talked for hours about books and ideas and dreams for the future. Martha's father, John Wayles, was one of Virginia's richest planters and a slave trader. He initially had reservations about Jefferson. The young lawyer was brilliant, yes, but he seemed more interested in books and architecture than in the practical business of making money. But Martha was determined, and on January 1st, 1772, they were married. Jefferson brought Martha home to Monticello, to the small one-room brick pavilion that was all he'd completed so far. It was a humble beginning for an ambitious house. but they were happy. The early years of their marriage were, by all accounts, deeply loving. Jefferson doted on Martha. He called her Patty, copied out love poems for her. He designed parts of Monticello specifically with her in mind. In September 1772, Martha gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Martha, but called Patsy. Jefferson was overjoyed. He recorded every detail in his memorandum books: the date, the time, the weather, that day. He was already displaying the meticulous record-keeping that would characterize his entire life. But shadows were gathering, both personal and political. In May 1773, Martha's father, John Wayles, died, and the inheritance revealed Jefferson's complicated relationship with slavery in stark terms. Martha inherited 135 enslaved people and substantial debts. This windfall made Jefferson one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia. But it also doubled the number of human beings he owned. Among the enslaved people Martha inherited was a family that would become central to Jefferson's private life and posthumous reputation: the Hemings family. Betty Hemings and her children had been enslaved by John Wayles. 3 of Betty's children, including Sally Hemings, were very likely fathered by John Wayles himself. Many thought about this. The letters between Thomas and Martha were destroyed after her death, at Jefferson's request. But she must have known. In the intimate world of plantation life, such things were impossible to hide. Meanwhile, the political situation between Britain and the colonies was deteriorating rapidly. In 1773, colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor. In 1774, Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, which Virginians called the Intolerable Acts. The crisis was building towards something terrible. No one knew quite what, but everyone could feel it coming. Jefferson, now a member of the House of Burgesses, was drawn deeper into revolutionary politics. In 1774, he wrote a bold pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America, arguing that Parliament had no authority over the colonies whatsoever. The pamphlet was too radical for many, but it established Jefferson as one of the intellectual leaders of the resistance movement. But even as Jefferson engaged in revolutionary politics, tragedy stalked his personal life. In April 1774, Martha gave birth to another daughter, Jane Randolph Jefferson. The baby died 17 months later. These were the days before modern medicine, when childhood death was heartbreakingly common. But that didn't make it easier to bear. Martha's health had never been strong, and each pregnancy weakened her further. She suffered from what was probably diabetes, though no one understood the disease then. After Jane's death, she became pregnant again, giving birth to a son in May 1777, whom they named after Martha's father. The baby lived only 17 days. Jefferson was torn between his public duties and his private anguish. In 1775, he had been sent to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where he was gaining fame for his clear writing and sharp thinking. But his heart was at Monticello with Martha, who was often ill and always anxious when he was away. In 1778, Martha became pregnant again, and this pregnancy seemed more successful. She gave birth to a daughter, Mary, called Polly by the family. The baby survived, giving the Jeffersons hope that perhaps the worst was behind them. It wasn't. In 1779, Jefferson was elected governor of Virginia, thrust into leadership during the darkest period of the Revolutionary War. British forces invaded Virginia. Jefferson and the legislature had to flee from Richmond, barely escaping capture. Jefferson's performance as governor was controversial. Some critics said he hadn't been aggressive enough in defending the state. Though he was constrained by lack of resources and legal authority, in April 1780, while Jefferson was still governor, Martha had another daughter, Lucy Elizabeth. But Martha never fully recovered from this birth. She grew weaker and weaker. In May 1781, Martha became pregnant again. This would be her 6th pregnancy in 9 years, and her body could take no more. Jefferson's term as governor ended in June 1781, and he gratefully returned to Monticello, determined to spend time with his failing wife. But Martha's condition worsened through the summer and fall. On May 8, 1782, she gave birth to another daughter, also named Lucy Elizabeth. Martha lingered for 4 more months, growing steadily weaker. Jefferson never left her side. For 4 months, he nursed her, sat with her, read to her, tried desperately to comfort her. Their daughter, Patsy, now 10 years old, later recalled her father's anguish. How he would pace the room, unable to bear watching Martha suffer, then return to sit by her bedside. Martha knew she was dying. Legend says she made Jefferson promise never to remarry. She couldn't bear the thought of another woman raising her daughters. He promised. On September 6, 1782, Martha Wayles Jefferson died. She was 33 years old. Of their 6 children, only Patsy and Polly survived. Jefferson was destroyed. For weeks, he wouldn't leave his room. He paced back and forth for hours, lost in grief. When he finally emerged, his daughter Patsy said he would take long rides through the mountains, sometimes for hours, as if trying to outrun his sorrow. He never recovered from Martha's death, not really. He never remarried, though he lived 44 more years. He kept her room exactly as she'd left it. He wore a locket with her hair until the day he died, in the margin of one of his books. Jefferson copied out a passage from the ancient Greek tragedy, the Iliad, where the hero Achilles mourns his beloved Patroclus. The passage speaks of grief that cannot be consoled, of love that death cannot end. Martha's death marked the end of Jefferson's truly private life. From this point forward, he would throw himself into public service with an intensity that seemed driven by the need to escape his grief. He would never again allow himself to be as vulnerable, as openly emotional, as he had been during those terrible months, watching Martha die. The Monticello he had built for love became a monument to loss. But it also became a laboratory of ideas, the home of a man who would help create a nation, and that creation was about to begin in earnest. In a hot Philadelphia summer, with a blank page and a world waiting to be born, in the spring of 1776, Thomas Jefferson returned to Philadelphia as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. He had been reluctant to leave Monticello while Martha was so ill, but duty called. The colonies were at war with Britain. Blood had been spilled at Lexington and Concord. The Continental Army, commanded by George Washington, was besieging Boston. Yet most delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. They wanted to remain British subjects if only the king would address their grievances. But King George III had declared the colonies in rebellion. Parliament had forbidden all trade with America. British ships were blockading American ports. Reconciliation was becoming impossible. Jefferson was 33 years old, one of the youngest delegates. He had a reputation as a brilliant writer, but he rarely spoke in debate. He would sit quietly through hours of argument, then go home and write clear, powerful summaries of the ideas discussed. His fellow Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, noticed this talent. So did John Adams of Massachusetts and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, 2 of the strongest advocates for independence. On June 7, 1776, Lee introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. The Congress erupted in debate. Some delegates wanted to delay. They needed more time to consult with their home colonies, to prepare for the break with Britain. But even the cautious delegates recognized that if the resolution passed, they would need a document explaining it, a formal statement to the world justifying this unprecedented act. On June 11th, Congress appointed a 5-member committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. The committee included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The committee met briefly and made a crucial decision. Jefferson should write the first draft. Adams later explained the choice. He was too controversial, too opinionated, too identified with New England radicalism. Jefferson was younger, from the powerful colony of Virginia, and he had a reputation for literature, science, and a happy talent for composition. Jefferson accepted the task and went to work. He rented rooms in a brick house on Market Street, on the 2nd floor, where he would have quiet and privacy. He brought his portable writing desk, a simple wooden box with a hinged top and a drawer for paper and ink. He had designed it himself. It was perfect for his needs. And then he began to write. Jefferson worked mainly alone, though he consulted with Adams and Franklin. He had no books with him, relying instead on ideas he'd absorbed over years of reading and thinking. But he wasn't trying to be original. As he later explained, the point wasn't to invent new ideas, but to express the common sense of the subject. In a way that would inspire people and justify the American cause, he drew on many sources. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason just weeks earlier, provided language about natural rights. John Locke's Second Treatise of Government supplied the philosophical framework about government deriving from the consent of the governed. His own thinking about British violations of colonial rights shaped the list of grievances. But the genius was in how. Jefferson synthesized these ideas into one coherent, powerful statement. The Declaration has 4 main parts, and each serves a crucial purpose. The first paragraph is the introduction, explaining why they're writing this document at all, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. This opening is significant. Jefferson isn't just writing for Americans or for the British. He's writing for a candid world. He's appealing to international opinion, particularly to France and Spain, whose support America would need to win the war. The second section is the preamble, the part everyone remembers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These words were revolutionary literally. Jefferson was arguing that legitimate government doesn't come from God's anointing of kings, from ancient tradition, or from conquest. It comes from the people themselves. And if a government fails to protect people's natural rights, the people have the right and the duty to abolish it. This was radical philosophy translated into clear, memorable prose. Jefferson took abstract Enlightenment ideas and made them concrete and urgent. The third section, the longest, lists specific grievances against King George III. This part often gets skipped today. But it was crucial for 18th century readers. They needed to see concrete evidence that the king had violated his obligations. That revolution was justified not by abstract philosophy alone, but by specific tyrannical acts. Jefferson listed 27 grievances, from dissolving colonial legislatures to imposing taxes without consent to quartering troops in colonists' homes. Each one was designed to show that the king had become a tyrant. One grievance particularly revealed Jefferson's own conflicted feelings about slavery. In his original draft, he blamed the king for the slave trade. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. This passage blamed the king for slavery while avoiding any discussion of American complicity. It was removed from the final version. Southern delegates wouldn't accept language criticizing slavery. Northern slave traders didn't like it either. Jefferson later called the deletion a shameful sacrifice of principle to politics. But he never freed his own slaves. The fourth section is the conclusion. The actual declaration, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Jefferson wrote the first draft in about 2 weeks. He showed it to Adams and Franklin, who made minor changes. Franklin, who had a gift for memorable phrases, changed Jefferson's. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable too. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The change was subtle, but important, from religious language to the language of reason. On June 28th, the committee presented the draft to Congress. Then came the hard part. For 3 days, from July 2nd to July 4th, Congress debated every word, every phrase, every punctuation mark. They deleted about a quarter of Jefferson's text, including his entire passage blaming the king for slavery. They softened some of his stronger language. They made countless small changes. Jefferson sat in his seat, miserable, watching his carefully crafted prose get chopped up. Benjamin Franklin noticed his distress and leaned over to tell him a story about a sign painter, trying to teach Jefferson the lesson that writing by committee is always painful, but the essential structure and most of the language survived. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the final version. We remember July 4th as Independence Day, but actually, Congress had voted for independence on July 2nd. July 4th was when they approved the Declaration itself. The document explaining and justifying that vote, the actual signing came later. Most delegates signed the engrossed copy on August 2nd, though some signed even later. But July 4th, 1776 was the date that went on the document, the date that would live in history. What had Jefferson created? On one level, it was a practical political document, a press release, announcing a new nation and asking for international recognition and support. On another level, it was a legal document, setting out the case for revolution in terms that reflected 18th century ideas. It's about rights and governance. But on the deepest level, it was something more, a statement of ideals that would outlive the immediate political circumstances that prompted it. All men are created equal. Unalienable rights. Safe. Liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Consent of the governed. These phrases became the philosophical foundation of the American experiment. They established standards against which all future American actions would be measured. They provided tools for every subsequent generation seeking to expand freedom and equality. Jefferson knew he'd written something important, though he couldn't have imagined how important it would become. In his later years, he would list authoring the Declaration of Independence as one of his 3 greatest achievements, along with writing the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and founding the University of Virginia. He never mentioned being President of the United States. That tells us something about what Jefferson valued: the power of ideas over the power of office, the permanent over the temporary, principles over politics. The Declaration of Independence didn't win the Revolutionary War. That would take 7 more years of blood and sacrifice. It didn't solve any of the practical problems facing the new nation. It didn't address the glaring contradiction of proclaiming equality while maintaining slavery, but it set out an aspiration. It said, this is what we believe. This is what we're fighting for. This is the kind of nation we hope to build. And for all of America's failures to live up to those ideals in there, have been many the ideals themselves have endured. They've inspired countless movements for justice and freedom. Not just in America, but around the world. The shy young man who sat at a portable desk in Philadelphia in June 1776, agonizing over every word, had given voice to something larger than himself. Larger even than America. He had written a statement of human dignity and rights that still echoes, almost 250 years later. In every struggle for freedom everywhere, the Declaration of Independence made Thomas Jefferson famous. But it didn't make his life easier. In fact, the years immediately following the Declaration were among the most challenging of Jefferson's life, marked by military crisis, political controversy, and profound personal loss. After helping create a new nation on paper, Jefferson had to help defend it in reality. In September 1776, Jefferson left Congress and returned to Virginia. He could have stayed in national politics, but he believed the real work of revolution happened at the state level. Virginia needed to transform from a royal colony into a self-governing republic, and Jefferson wanted to lead that transformation. He was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, where he immediately began the most ambitious legislative project of his life: the complete revision of Virginia's laws. Jefferson believed that political independence without legal reform was meaningless. Virginia's laws were still based on British monarchy and aristocratic privilege. If America was to be a republic based on equality and natural rights, every law needed to be examined and rewritten. Jefferson worked with George Wythe and Edmund Pendleton on this project for 3 years. They proposed 126 bills covering everything from criminal justice to education to religious freedom. Many failed, but some passed. And they gradually transformed Virginia society. The most important was Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom. Though it wouldn't pass until 1786, years after Jefferson first proposed it, this bill declared that no one could be forced to support any church or punished for their religious beliefs. It established the separation of church and state that would later be enshrined in the First Amendment. Jefferson considered this bill almost as important as the Declaration of Independence. He wrote, "Almighty God hath created the mind free. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishments are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion." He also proposed a bill for universal public education, radical for his time. Jefferson believed that democracy required educated citizens. He wanted Virginia to establish free elementary schools, secondary schools for the talented, and a university at the apex. The bill failed. Taxpayers didn't want to pay for it, but the idea would haunt Jefferson for decades. In 1779, Virginia's legislature elected Jefferson governor. He was 36 years old, and he was taking office during the darkest period of the Revolutionary War. The British had shifted their strategy, focusing on conquering the southern states. And Virginia, the largest and richest state, was a prime target. Jefferson's 2 years as governor were difficult and controversial. He faced impossible challenges: limited resources, an undisciplined militia, no navy, and growing British military pressure. In late 1780, Benedict Arnold, the American general who had turned traitor, led a British force up the James River toward Richmond, Virginia's capital. Jefferson had to evacuate the government with only hours' notice. The British occupied Richmond briefly, burning buildings and seizing supplies. Then, in 1781, British General Cornwallis led a much larger force into Virginia. Jefferson had to evacuate again, this time from Charlottesville. British cavalry raided Monticello itself, nearly capturing Jefferson. He barely escaped, riding down the mountain as British soldiers searched his house. Some Virginians blamed Jefferson for these disasters. They said he wasn't aggressive enough, that he should have declared martial law, that he let the British run wild. A formal inquiry was launched into his conduct as governor. Jefferson was deeply wounded by these criticisms. He had worked tirelessly under impossible circumstances. Virginia had no standing army, limited weapons, and a legislature that often wouldn't fund defensive measures. What could he have done differently? The inquiry eventually cleared him completely, finding that he had performed well under difficult circumstances. But the damage to Jefferson's pride was severe. He had always prided himself on his service to the public good, and now he was being accused of cowardice and incompetence. In June 1781, when his second term as governor ended, Jefferson announced his retirement from public life. He was 38 years old, exhausted, and grieving. His daughter Lucy Elizabeth had died at age 4 months while he was governor, and Martha was declining rapidly. He returned to Monticello, determined never to hold public office again. But after Martha's death in September 1782, that determination wavered. Monticello was full of memories that tormented him. His work seemed meaningless. He fell into a deep depression. It was James Madison, Jefferson's close friend, who helped pull him back. Madison urged him to return to public service, arguing that his country needed him and that work might help him heal. In late 1782, Congress appointed Jefferson as a peace commissioner to help negotiate the treaty ending the Revolutionary War. By the time Jefferson could sail for Europe, the treaty was already signed, so he returned home. But Congress had another job for him. In 1783, Jefferson was elected to the Confederation Congress. He moved to Annapolis, Maryland, bringing his eldest daughter Patsy with him. His younger daughter Polly stayed in Virginia with relatives. Jefferson couldn't manage both daughters while serving in Congress. In Congress, Jefferson was characteristically productive. He served on dozens of committees. He drafted ordinances for organizing and admitting new states from Western territories. He proposed the decimal system for American currency, dollars and cents instead of pounds. shillings and pen switch Congress adopted. Most importantly, Jefferson drafted what became the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, though the final version wasn't passed until after he'd left for Europe. This ordinance established how territories would become states, guaranteed certain rights to settlers, and in Jefferson's original version banned slavery from all territories. The slavery ban was deleted by a single vote. Jefferson later called this one of history's great misfortunes, arguing that if slavery had been excluded from the Western territories, it might have gradually disappeared from America. Instead, it spread west, setting up the conditions that would eventually lead to civil war. But even as Jefferson served in Congress, he was struggling. He missed his daughters. He was lonely. Monticello needed his attention, and Martha's loss still haunted him. Then, in 1784, Congress offered him a new position that would change everything: Minister to France. The United States needed to establish diplomatic relations with European powers, negotiate trade treaties, and convince European governments that America was a real nation worth recognizing. Benjamin Franklin was already in Paris, serving as America's most effective diplomat. Congress wanted Jefferson to join him. Jefferson accepted immediately. He saw it as an opportunity to see the great world beyond America, to contribute to his country's security, and perhaps most importantly, to escape the memories that filled every corner of Monticello. In July 1784, Jefferson and his daughter Patsy sailed for France. His younger daughter Polly would join them later. Jefferson didn't know it, but he would spend the next 5 years in Europe, 5 years that would profoundly shape his political philosophy and set the stage for the bitter political battles of his presidential years. The provincial Virginia planter was about to become a man of the world, and what he saw in Europe would convince him more than ever that America's experiment in Republican government was not just important, it was essential for human freedom. Thomas Jefferson arrived in Paris in August 1784, and the city overwhelmed him. Paris was the cultural capital of Europe, home to nearly 600,000 people, more than 20 times the size of Philadelphia. It was a city of astonishing contrasts: magnificent architecture and elegant gardens alongside filth and poverty, brilliant salons discussing philosophy alongside brutal inequality, refined manners masking ruthless political intrigue. Jefferson loved it and was repulsed by it in equal measure. He established himself in a beautiful house on the Champs-Élysées, enrolled his daughter Patsy in a convent school, and threw himself into diplomatic work and cultural exploration. His official title was Minister Plenipotentiary, essentially ambassador. Though the position was less formal than modern ambassadors, his job was to negotiate commercial treaties, maintain good relations with America's crucial Revolutionary War ally, and generally advocate for American interests. He worked alongside John Adams, who was minister to England, and Benjamin Franklin, who had been in Paris throughout the war. When Franklin returned to America in 1785, Jefferson succeeded him as the sole American minister to France. People would ask Jefferson if he was Franklin's replacement. He would reply, "No one can replace Dr. Franklin. I am only his successor." The diplomatic work was challenging. European nations didn't take America seriously. They saw a confederation of squabbling states that couldn't pay its debts, couldn't regulate commerce, and might fall apart at any moment. Why negotiate serious treaties with a nation that might not exist in a few years? Jefferson worked tirelessly to change these perceptions. He negotiated a consular convention with France. He worked with John Adams to establish commercial treaties with European and North African nations. He dealt with the thorny problem of American debt to French creditors. But more than formal diplomacy, Jefferson's real achievement in France was representing America as an idea, not just a place. He wrote about American democracy, natural rights, and republican government. He corresponded with French intellectuals, explaining the American experiment. He became, in effect, America's chief propagandist in the intellectual circles of Europe, and the timing was perfect. France in the 1780s was bubbling with revolutionary fervor. Intellectuals debated radical ideas about equality, rights, and government. The French monarchy was collapsing under debt and incompetence. People were reading books about republican government and wondering if France could have its own revolution. Jefferson was in the middle of these conversations. He knew all the leading intellectuals, the philosophers, scientists, writers, and reformers who would later lead the French Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought in the American Revolution, became one of his closest friends. They would meet regularly to discuss politics and philosophy, but Jefferson's time in France wasn't all work. He also discovered art, architecture, music, fine living on a scale impossible in America. He visited Roman ruins in southern France and marveled at ancient engineering. He studied French architecture and purchased hundreds of books on art and building design. He attended operas and concerts. He bought paintings and sculpture to ship back to America. He fell in love with French architecture's elegance and symmetry. The classical style he saw in France, derived from ancient Rome, became his ideal. He started redesigning Monticello in his mind, planning changes he would make when he returned home. He also fell in love with a woman, though. How serious it was remains debated. Her name was Maria Causeway. She was an accomplished artist, beautiful, charming, and trapped in an unhappy marriage to a much older English painter. Jefferson met her in August 1786, and they spent several weeks together, exploring Paris, visiting gardens and museums, talking about art and life. The relationship was almost certainly romantic, though probably not sexual. Jefferson wrote her a famous letter called The Dialogue Between My Head and My Heart, in which his head and heart debate whether he was wise to let himself care for someone he couldn't be with. It's one of the most revealing personal documents Jefferson ever wrote. Showing his emotional side that he usually kept hidden, Maria returned to England, and they corresponded for years, though they rarely saw each other again. The relationship suggests Jefferson's deep loneliness after Martha's death and his need for emotional connection, even if he couldn't allow himself full romantic commitment. Meanwhile, Jefferson's younger daughter, Polly Mary, finally joined him in Paris in 1787. She arrived accompanied by Sally Hemings, a 14-year-old enslaved girl from Monticello, sent to care for her on the journey. This is where Jefferson's life becomes most controversial. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife Martha, the daughter of Martha's father by an enslaved woman. She was about 30 years younger than Jefferson, according to oral history maintained by Sally's descendants. Jefferson began a sexual relationship with Sally in Paris. She was 14 or 15. He was 44. DNA evidence published in 1998 strongly suggests that Jefferson fathered at least some of Sally's children. Was it rape? By modern standards, absolutely a 14-year-old enslaved girl could not consent to sex with the man who owned her. But Jefferson's relationship with Sally would last nearly 40 years until his death. They would have 6 children together, and Jefferson freed all 4 who survived to adulthood. The only enslaved family he ever freed. This relationship embodies the deepest contradictions of Jefferson's life and of America itself. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," held human beings as property. The champion of consent governed maintained a relationship with a woman who couldn't freely consent. The advocate for freedom lived in a system of slavery he benefited from, and never know what Sally Hemings thought or felt. She left no written record. We don't know if she felt any affection for Jefferson, or if she simply made the best of an impossible situation. We know only that she bore his children and that he quietly freed them all. But in 1787, these contradictions weren't yet fully apparent. Jefferson was focused on bigger political changes happening around him. The United States was in crisis. The Articles of Confederation, the loose governing agreement among the states, wasn't working. States fought with each other. The national government couldn't raise money or regulate trade. Some feared America would split into multiple nations or collapse into anarchy in Philadelphia. Delegates gathered for a constitutional convention to try to fix these problems. Jefferson wasn't there. He was in Paris, but his friends kept him informed. James Madison sent him letters describing the debates and the proposed new constitution. Jefferson's response was mixed. He liked some parts, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the Republican structure, but he worried about others. The Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. The president could serve unlimited terms. There was too much power centralized in the federal government. He wrote to Madison, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth." Madison listened. When the first Congress met under the new Constitution, Madison drafted the Bill of Rights, drawing heavily on Jefferson's suggestions. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, protecting freedom of speech, religion, press, and other fundamental rights so much to Jefferson's insistence from Paris. Meanwhile, France was heading toward revolution. By 1788, the French monarchy was essentially bankrupt. King Louis XVI was forced to call the Estates Generales, representative assembly that hadn't met in 175 years, to address the crisis. Jefferson watched with excitement and some trepidation. He believed France needed reform, that the absolute monarchy was oppressive and unsustainable. But he also knew that revolutions were dangerous, unpredictable things. In July 1789, the French Revolution began in earnest. A Parisian mob stormed the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal tyranny. Lafayette, Jefferson's friend, was a leader of the moderate reformers trying to create a constitutional monarchy. Jefferson was asked to advise Lafayette and other reformers as they drafted a French Declaration of Rights, modeled partly on America's Declaration of Independence. He did so, though he tried to remain officially neutral as an American diplomat. But by September 1789, Jefferson knew it was time to leave. The French Revolution was becoming violent and chaotic. More importantly, President George Washington wanted him to come home to serve as America's first Secretary of State. Jefferson sailed from France in October 1789. He brought his daughters, several of the Hemings family members, including Sally and her brother James, crates of books, furniture, paintings, and wine. He thought he was leaving temporarily, perhaps, taking a brief appointment as Secretary of State before returning to France. Or better yet, retiring to Monticello. He didn't realize that he was sailing toward the most bitter political battles of his life. Conflicts that would define American politics for generations and nearly tear the young nation apart. The scholar and diplomat was about to become a fierce partisan, fighting for the soul of the American Republic.